In just over 100 days, someone will be elected to the most important political job in the world. The Democrats have yet to make a formal decision on their candidate. It's not looking good for the president. Mr. Biden is increasingly isolated in every way, leaving the field free for his rival to fight, fight, fight. Meanwhile, here, Labour starts its victory lap with the King's speech. It's going to last 10 years, says Starmer. But union leaders are lining up to spoil the party. Pay up, they say, or get ready for strike, strike, strike. James Murray is the Exchequer Secretary to the Treasury and joins us in a week when the scale of the money problems facing Labour and government are starkly laid bare. More borrowing and bigger than expected pay claims in the public sector. The big question is how to get growth. And is it possible to balance the books without borrowing more? Lord Ben Houchen is now the most powerful elected Conservative in the country. The Tees Valley Mayor is an extremely rare thing, a Tory in the north. And that means his views on the future of the party are crucial. We'll try to find out who he'd like as leader. Will Joe Biden fight the election against Donald Trump? The president insists he's staying, but ever-growing numbers of his own side say it's time for him to step aside for someone younger. We'll get a view from the party with Democrats Abroad UK Chair Kristin Kaplan Wolfe. The new Culture Secretary says that the culture wars are over under a Labour government. If only it was that easy. There seems plenty of conflict still around, from trans rights to religious tension. Plus, we're expecting a new Race Equality Act. So we'll be joined by the Equality and Human Rights Commission Chair, Baroness Falkner. Plus, with us throughout the show, the former BBC Director General and FA Chair, Greg Dyke, Politico's head of podcasting and host of the Power Play Weekly interview podcast, Anne McElvoy, and the broadcaster, Iain Dale. Welcome to Sunday Morning with Trevor Phillips. Whatever decision emerges from the Biden household in Delaware, it is very likely that in Milwaukee this week, we've seen the anointment of the next American president. And with the Democrats in turmoil, the chances are that by Christmas, the White House, Congress, and the Supreme Court will all be in Mr. Trump's hands. But the most significant moment of the convention came with his vice presidential pick. Historically, the VP is there just to balance the ticket. John F. Kennedy, a Northerner, chose Lyndon Baines Johnson, a Southerner. Ronald Reagan, a free market radical, picked an establishment moderate, George Bush. Joe Biden, a white man, opted for a black woman, Kamala Harris. But Mr. Trump's running mate is in many ways a younger version of himself. White, male, isolationist, and anti-woke. Paradoxically, both men, strident opponents of immigration, are married to women whose families' origins lie outside America, in Slovenia and India. I think that for Mr. Trump, who can only serve one term, the choice is a declaration of intent. He means his MAGA movement to survive long after him. That's why J.D. Vance matters not so much as a deputy as a crown prince. The challenge for our new Prime Minister is how best to manage the special relationship over the next decade if, in the words of the Foreign Secretary, the American state is led by a neo-Nazi and his protégé. I'm joined now by the Exchequer Secretary to the Treasury, James Murray. Good morning, Mr. Murray.
Hi, good morning.
Let's start at home. Presumably you've had a first look at the books, and how big is the financial hole we're in? Bigger, smaller, or as you expected?
Well, look, we were warning throughout the election campaign that we would be likely to inherit the worst set of circumstances since the Second World War. And frankly, since we've taken office, everything we've seen so far has confirmed that. The Chancellor asked Treasury officials in her first few days in office to conduct a thorough assessment of the state of public finances and public spending, and she'll be reporting that to Parliament by the end of the month. So setting out the real scale of the challenge, the inheritance that we have been left by the last Conservative government.
So you're not surprised yet, but let's look at this morning's news. We understand that the pay review bodies are recommending above-inflation rises for teachers and some NHS workers. The IFS estimates that the additional cost of a 5.5% pay rise, which is what people are talking about, for public sector workers is about £10 billion. Now, let's start. When the Chancellor says, and I'm quoting here, we will do it in a proper way, does that mean she plans to honour that commitment?
Well, what the Chancellor means by that comment is that her approach is to look at the pay review body's recommendations, and she will then come to Parliament at the end of the month and set out our response in the context of the public finances and the public spending inheritance that we have in government. So the proper way to do it is to consider the recommendations of the pay review bodies, to also look at this full analysis that I just mentioned of the public finances and the state of public spending, and then to set out our response to Parliament, which the Chancellor will do by the end of the month.
Yeah, but she's already said that the consequences, I think the word she uses, costs, of not honouring the recommendations are worse. So let's be clear, you are going to honour the pay review body's recommendations. How you do it, we'll talk about, but you're going to say yes to them.
Well, let's be clear that there is a cost, obviously, to the response to the pay review body's recommendations. But I think what the Chancellor was saying is that there's also a cost to not striking a deal, because you then run the risk of industrial action. There are longer-term problems in terms of recruitment and retention of teachers, of people who work in the NHS, of police officers and so on. So, we need to set out our way forward. But to come back to the point you made about the proper process is to consider the pay review body's recommendations and then set out our response in light of the public finances and the public spending inheritance.
But the response can either be yes or no, or at this moment, I don't know. Which is it?
Well, it'll be within our fiscal rules. And as the Chancellor has said right throughout the campaign and absolutely in office, our fiscal rules are non-negotiable. And so the response will be within those parameters. But obviously the right way to do it, again, the proper way of doing this is to look at the recommendations from the pay review bodies and then to set out to Parliament a response in the context of public finances.
You're the Exchequer Secretary, and I'm not, so you obviously can add up. But even I can tell, if you are going to keep this within the fiscal rules, you're never going to pay 5.5%. You're never going to find £10 billion, are you?
Well, look, I'm not going to prejudge the process because, as you said, the Chancellor's been very clear about there being a proper process around this, around looking at the pay review body's recommendations, around looking at the public finances, looking at the public spending inheritance that we've had. And I think, what's really clear, if I can just say what's really clear, though, is that because the inheritance is so bad, that's one reason why, as well as asking for that assessment of the public finances in the first weekend when the Chancellor took office, she also asked for the Treasury to get on with growth measures and get the economy growing, because otherwise we're never going to break out of this.
You're not going to get growth in the next 3 or 4 months. So just to make this a little less murky, you've got to find £10 billion if you're going to pay 5.5% and avoid strikes and all the rest of it, or if you don't want to meet the 5.5%, you need to say, look, guys, it's not going to come, it's not going to happen. Can you be a little more helpful to NHS workers and teachers right now? If you're going to stick within the fiscal rules, you cannot pay the 5.5%, can you? Unless you want to raise tax.
Well, I think what's not helpful for me to do for any workers in the public sector is to preempt the process that we're going through right now. There is a proper process. That's what we're going through.
I'm just talking about arithmetic. I'm not talking about... we don't need the process to understand the arithmetic.
Well, the process is one of looking at the pay review body's recommendations, but also having this assessment of the state of the public finances. We know that they are the worst since the Second World War. And as I said, everything we've seen so far has confirmed that. But we need this proper analysis of the public finances. And that's why the Chancellor instructed Treasury officials to do that as soon as she took office.
All right. Well, look, let's suppose that we take the Chancellor at what appears to be her words, that we will meet this requirement. Would that money have to come out of existing education and health budgets?
Well, I'm not going to start preempting what the Chancellor's going to say at the end of the month.
But how would you do it if you could, in principle? Or let's just agree. Let's do the hypothetical. If you were to say yes, we're going to meet this requirement or something like this recommendation or something like it, you have to find whatever it is, 5, 10 billion. That can't come out of existing budget, can it, or can it?
Well, look, this is a hypothetical that is several steps down the line, and I think it's really important to respect the process that we've set out around the Chancellor committing to looking at the pay review body recommendations, around the assessment of the public finances, and her commitment to come to Parliament by the end of the month. You know, it's only a few weeks away now, and that will be set out in Parliament in terms of our response.
Well, I think most people would take from what you just said that actually, though she's sort of sending a sort of jolly, happy signal, if you are going to stick to the fiscal rules, it's your job, she's not going to pay up.
Well, as I say, she'll set that out at the end of the month in Parliament, but the fiscal rules are non-negotiable. But if I can just say as well, Trevor, that this point around growing the economy is really important, because otherwise, if we don't get the economy growing, we're going to be having the same conversation year after year. And that's why one of the Chancellor's priorities that first weekend was to get the Treasury on with the growth measures as well.
Well, you understand why I press on this, because the truth is, if you're going to stick to the fiscal rules you're going to go anywhere towards meeting these recommendations, you're going to have to raise tax. But let's not go on about it. Let's do it with something that's actually real, where you've actually already made a decision. And it's a pressing claim on the Exchequer. Many people in your party think that you should set out a timetable now to abolish the 2-child cap on benefits. So I want to ask you this. You've made a choice already. You have chosen to find an extra £13 billion to keep the triple lock on pensions alive, but you couldn't find £3.5 billion to alleviate child poverty. Now, according to one of your own new MPs, Torsten Bell, used to run the Resolution Foundation, if you lifted the cap, 500,000 children would instantly be out of poverty. Why can't you do that?
We can't promise to do that because of the state
you
of
could
the public
promise
finances.
To pay pensioners £13 billion extra. You've made a choice.
Well, look, we have inherited the public finances as they are. And let me be really clear that all Labour MPs think that no child should grow up in poverty.
You just spent 4 weeks telling us about change. You can't just say, oh, we're going to change, and then say, oh, sorry, we can't do anything about it.
Well, what we've actually...
You made this choice.
No, but if I can just say, what we've actually spent the last few weeks during the election campaign also saying is that we are never going to make any promises that we can't say exactly how they're going to be paid for. We're never going to make a commitment where we can't say where the money is coming from. You know, we know that economic stability, that fiscal responsibility...
I'm not asking you to do that.
...underlies everything that we want to do.
I'm asking you why you made this particular choice. And let me just put it boldly. It's a matter of priorities. There are 1 million pensioner households who earn £1,000 a week after housing costs. We give £5.5 billion to pensioners living abroad. And let me show you something. This is the comparison of children in poverty compared to pensioners. There are twice as many children in this country, 4.2 million, living in poverty as there are pensioners. I'm not asking you about putting more money. I'm not asking you about raising more taxes. But you have made the choice to favour pensioners over children. Is that the kind of change that we can, the set of priorities we can expect from the Starmer government going forward?
Well, the set of priorities you can expect are the ones that we set out in the manifesto. And look, when you
well,
see
one of the ones you set out was child poverty, and you haven't done anything about it. You've given...
No, that's not correct. We have already begun the work to set out an ambitious, comprehensive child poverty strategy. The Secretary of State...
Yeah, but it doesn't involve giving any money to them. You've given all the money to old people.
But we're not going to make commitments that we can't say exactly where the money is coming from. And look, let's be clear that all Labour MPs feel that far too many children's life chances are being scarred by poverty. No child should grow up in poverty. And that's why the Prime Minister has set out this task force, which is going to develop a child poverty strategy straight away.
But my point is, you set up a task force, which, by the way, doesn't apparently have anybody on from the Treasury on it. You set up a task force when you had the opportunity to say, we're not going to stick with the triple lock. We're going to give money that will help to solve the child poverty problem. What you've done is given the pensioners the money and you've given the children a task force. Is that right?
We were very clear in our manifesto that we would only make commitments that we can say how they'd be paid for and where the money would come from. And actually, if you start making unfunded spending commitments, that crashes the economy. We know that. We saw that happen under the last government. And if the economy crashes, the economic turbulence that creates harms all of society, but particularly the most vulnerable, particularly children and families. So, this economic responsibility, fiscal responsibility, is not a nice to have. It's an absolutely essential part of how we want to govern.
Let me ask you about something coming out of the King's speech. Have ministers apologised to Liz Truss for the initial briefing on the King's speech, which described her economic programme as a disaster?
Have ministers apologised? Has Liz Truss apologised, do you mean?
No, but the point is that this is a civil service briefing, and it described the previous government, their previous masters' actions as a disaster. That's not in line with the standards of integrity that you've promised us, is it?
Well, I don't know that particular briefing you're talking about, but I think everyone...
There's 100 page plus that went out with the King's speech.
Everyone knows that what Liz Truss did to the economy was a disaster. It crashed the economy. People are still paying the price for it now. And actually, the lesson that we take from what Liz Truss did is that if you make unfunded spending commitments, it not only crashes the economy, it harms the most vulnerable in society the most, which is why, in the context of the discussion we've just been having, making sure that all of our commitments are fully funded and we can say exactly where the money is going to come from is so important.
All right, before we finish, I just want to take you down memory lane for a moment. Let's see if you can remember this, this picture. This is the Trump baby blimp, which has floated over London with the mayor's permission in 2018 when Mr. Trump visited London. At the time, you were the deputy mayor of London. Do you now wish you hadn't chosen to insult him in this way?
Well, look, there's been a lot of history in terms of the mayor and President Trump, but for what's important for me, being a minister in government, is that we have a relationship with the US, which is an incredibly strong one, and it's one that's in our national interest to get the best out of our national security.
It's quite tricky to have a good relationship with somebody when one of your colleagues has described him as a neo-Nazi, and your former boss called him literally a few weeks ago a racist, a sexist and a homophobe. Is that the way that we do diplomacy these days under Labour?
Well, look, I think in the past there have been comments on all sides of this relationship, but what's important for me is the strength of the relationship and delivering for the British people, because we know that...
That's my point, though. The strength of the relationship with somebody that you've called a neo-Nazi is not going to be very, very substantial, is it?
The strength of the relationship between the US and the UK, transcends any individuals or any individual comments here and there. What it's about is the strength of the relationship between our two countries. It's in our interest in terms of national security, it's in our interest in terms of economic growth. And we will put that front and centre, making sure that we are standing up for Britain's national interests and getting the best deal we can from our relationship with the US.
You understand why this is an issue, don't you? Because Foreign Secretary, who said all these things about Mr. Trump, is now calling Mr. Vance his friend, and your boss, the Chancellor, is already talking about a new trade deal with the United States. You're all going to have to change your tune, aren't you?
Well, we have never changed our tune in terms of the approach to the US. The US is one of our most important partners.
Donald Trump is going to be the President of the United States, probably.
Well, Trevor, but the point is, whoever is President of the United States, the relationship between the UK and the US, well, that's for the American people to decide who the candidates and who the victor is. What's for us to decide is what relationship we want to have with the US, and we want to have that strong relationship working together on our common goals around security and economic growth, because that's in our national interest in the UK.
James Murray, thank you for your time this morning.
Thank you.
OK, let's see what our panel made of all that. We're joined all morning by the former BBC Director General and FA Chair, Greg Dyke, Politico's head of podcasting and the host of the Power Play weekly interview podcast, Iain McElvoy, and the broadcaster, Iain Dale. Greg, they've been in there less than 2 weeks, and there's already trouble on the horizon, isn't there?
Well, there was always going to be trouble on the horizon, because there was always going to be a lot of people who wanted to catch up in terms of salaries from where they've been, where they've lost in recent years. But, I mean, you've got pay review bodies. If they make a recommendation, this government's going to have to accept them, isn't it?
Well, I couldn't quite get from Mr. Murray whether the government has to accept it or not. And he seemed to be uncertain about whether they're going to say yes or no to this.
I think that's just uncertain about what Rachel Reeves finally wants to do about this. I do agree with Greg. I think the mood music from Labour is that they would like to get this out of the way early. The Conservatives clearly had problems of failing to kind of cauterise those pay claims, particularly in the NHS. If you're going to go through a big spend on this, it is going to come out of other things. And I hear a lot of people very concerned of what it means about schools' budgets and that education promises will probably come up a bit empty. But you can also see, if you've seen the government struggling in strikes in the public sector, you're a new government that's come in, you want to give something back also to your Labour base and the unions, that you might decide, if you're Rachel Reeves, she'll just loosen those purse strings a bit. I also couldn't quite work out whether the story was true as reported, that it definitely meant hitting the same numbers that the pay review bodies were proposing, or whether there'd be a bit of shaving off. But once you start mucking about with that, it looks like you've failed to rise to the number. So it might be better just to do the number and then be mean down the line.
Iain, what do you think? I mean, on the one hand, there could be trouble. On the other hand, maybe they'll want to show that they're strong.
Well, I think it will send a signal as to what the next 5 years is going to be like, whatever Rachel Reeves decides to do. Because the last government did generally accept pay review body recommendations, but they weren't enough for the unions. I mean, that's really why we've had all of the junior doctors' strikes over the last 18 months or so. So if you think about it, the pay review bodies are recommending, 5.5% for the public sector. Inflation is 2%, so that's double the rate of inflation. Now, I could perfectly imagine Rachel Reeves saying, well, this is unsustainable. I'm the Iron Chancellor and I'm not going to give pay rises double the rate of inflation. So, but if she doesn't do that, then that will encourage bigger pay claims in the future.
Yes, I imagine that there's a queue of people, and somebody we've had on this programme a few times, Sharon Graham, yes, the boss of Unite, will be watching this very carefully, sitting with her spreadsheet.
And I'll tell you what, I wouldn't want to be a boss on the other side of the negotiating table to Sharon Graham. Well,
there speaks somebody who has also interviewed
exactly.
her. You're absolutely right. This is not a person you want to mess about with. It's a problem for them, though, isn't it?
Yeah, but it was bound to come, wasn't it? People in the public sector who have lost real wages over a period of years were bound to want to catch up. And you can understand that. I mean, that's exactly the argument the doctors make. Now, which depends which year you go back to and the rest of it. But there is no doubt people in the public sector have lost value over the years, and they're going to try to catch it up.
Can I just chip in? I don't think that particularly this Labour government does mind whether it picks a bit of a fight with union leaders like Sharon Graham, where they haven't had a particularly warm relationship, not seen as a union leader close to the Labour Party, and there are some who are. So I think that's something where the symbolism will be, yes, we want more rights for working people. If you notice, it's often couched much more in rights than it's couched in money. So I'm not so sure, actually, that they mind. Maybe Iain had a bruising time with her, but Kira and Rachel might feel differently.
I think the outcome of the junior doctors dispute is going to be key here, because Wes Streeting, he always talks a good game. Now, I have no doubt about it that in the next 2 or 3 weeks there will be a settlement to that. But will it be on the basis of him saying to them, well, we absolutely agree you need to catch up the 35%, but we can't do that in 1 or 2 years. That's got to be over 5 years. Now, I think that would be a perfectly reasonable thing to do. It's something that the last government should have done. But if they agree on 3 years, I think that will be seen as the Labour government giving in to the BMA.
Well, he will also, as he said several times in here, be talking about reforms in exchange for money. But one of the things that James Murray was very, very adamant about, fiscal rules. You know, that the debt as proportion of GDP has to come down, that we're not going to borrow to spend and all of that stuff. If that is true, and they pay this 5.5%, are we heading for tax rises?
I've always believed we're going to have tax rises. And they're bound to.
Thank you. You're a sunny. You're a blast, a ray of sunshine this morning.
What else do you do? Now the question is, where are the tax rises? And they've ruled out certain areas, but I could come up with some areas where they could put up tax quite easily and get quite a lot of money, and that's what they're going to do.
And they will have to do it. Because if you want to introduce public service reforms, yes, it is partly about reform, but it's also about extra spending. You cannot do what they want to do in the health service and provide much better outcomes without putting further money in, as long as the money is spent properly. Now, West Streeting's already said, well, it can be a bit of a money pit, and we all know that that's right. But if after 3 years of a Labour government, nobody is seeing any difference in the service levels from public services, they're going to be in great trouble going up to the next election. And so I think there's got to be some extra spending in various areas. And Greg's right, there are places. And I know what's going to happen in the budget. Rachel Reeves will stand up and say, oh, the situation's far worse than we ever thought it would be, and therefore I'm afraid we're going to have to put up taxes.
Well, you heard it here first, the striking consensus that we are going to face tax rises and so on. But one other thing which I talked to Murray about, which is this issue of the choice. I mean, tax rises and all the rest of it aside, they went straight for confirming triple lock, but they won't commit to spending money in relation to child poverty. Do you think that's a real issue? And the reason I'm asking this is I want to show you something else, which is this, which slightly surprised me. And this is the public's attitude towards a two-child cap. It's really striking that the British public, contrary to a lot of the commentary, like the two-child cap. Does that surprise you, Iain? It surprised me.
No, actually it doesn't, because that was one of the reasons I think it was, the actual figure, give or take, it would be less surprising to me. I think once you start to go to voters on the left, Labour and anywhere to the left of Labour, you get a very strong, visceral dislike of the policy.
Not according to that.
Well, actually, that's... let's not argue stats. You and your stats. I have found that generally to be true when you've researched it and focus grouped it. I think one of the problems with it is, of course, that those who suffer most from it is any child born into a poor household, and often there's a lot of stress there that is about money and more than money. So I think a lot of the new Labour intake are not very happy about it at all. But it is seen as partly a sort of welfare. We are stringent on welfare. We want you to go to work, and the way to get out of poverty is to get into work and then be paid a bit more in the workplace. But I think overall, a lot of people think these are, if people want to have more children, then they should go to work.
Greg, do you think this is one of the things that the new Labour leadership or the new Labour government is going to have a fight with its own people about?
Not initially, but I think in the end they will get rid of the two-child benefit cap when they've got the money to do it, because I think there's a lot of evidence that it does make a difference on child poverty, and that matters. But and that matters to the Labour Party, and it matters to them. They said in their manifesto that they made no mention of it. They weren't going to do it at this stage, and they won't do it at this stage, but it will, at some stage they will change it.
Why would you change your mind about it, though, given that it's a signal? It's really a political signal, I think, and maybe, slightly fighting with Iain about that second line there, but I think that's why you have it. It doesn't work particularly effectively, so it's there for another reason.
Well, you say it doesn't work. Are you talking about in terms of the voters?
Why would Labour change their mind about it?
Because it's not about the voters, it's about child poverty. And it would help child poverty. You might go from 2 to 3 initially and all sorts of things.
OK.
But I think it will be, they will do it.
Iain, just a quick one before we move on. I want to come back to talk about Biden and Trump and all of that towards the back end of the programme. But do you think Labour's got a specific problem because of its attitude, Sadiq Khan, I know you've talked to Lammy and so on, what Labour leaders have said about Trump? Is that going to be a problem, or is everybody going to forget it?
Well, we will find out. I think that there was all that speculation before the election about whether David Lammy would be Foreign Secretary, and I think that was largely based on these comments about Trump. And it is quite clear that barring events, Trump will be the next president of the United States. Now, I don't think these comments are unsurmountable or insurmountable. I don't know what the correct word is. Because, I mean, people always say things about political opponents that sometimes might come back to bite them. It's happened many times before. It'll happen again. It'll be a little bit embarrassing. But, I mean, if Trump takes to somebody, like he has with Vance, I mean, think of the things that Vance said about him, far worse than what David Lammy has.
OK, we'll come back to all of that a bit later on. It is 9 o'clock. You're watching Sunday Morning with Trevor Phillips. The Exchequer Secretary to the Treasury has told this programme that the government's fiscal rules are non-negotiable when asked about inflation-busting pay rises for public sector workers. James Murray said there was a cost to the economy from strikes if pay claims weren't met. Well, there's still plenty for you to stick around for this morning. Shortly, we'll turn to the future of the Conservative Party and speak to the Mayor of the Tees Valley, Lord Houchen. Then we'll try to work out if Joe Biden really can stay on and fight that election against Donald Trump. I'll speak to Democrats Abroad UK Chair Kristin Kaplan Wolfe. And are the culture wars over or just entering a new phase? Equality and Human Rights Commission Chair Baroness Falkner will join us live. The Conservatives are still licking their wounds after the devastating election defeat. Leadership hopefuls are gathering, but no one's explicitly launched a campaign yet. We don't know what the process will look like or how long it will last. But different prospective leaders will offer vastly different visions of what the party might become. Lord Ben Houchen is now the most powerful elective Conservative in the country, and that rarest of things now, a popular Tory in the north, popular Tory anywhere, really. So, what does he think? The Tees Valley Mayor joins me now. Good morning, Lord Houchen.
Morning, thanks for having me on.
Well, one of the first steps that the new government took was to bring together the metro mayors and regional leaders. You were the only Tory in the room, I think. Did you feel welcome, and was there a genuine concern for devolved government?
I did feel welcome, actually, and I think it was very telling of the Prime Minister that probably 24, 48 hours of the first full day in office, he invited all of the Metro mayors into Downing Street, something that while the Conservative government were very supportive of devolution and actually started it under George Osborne and David Cameron, there was never a collective meeting of mayors in Downing Street, and this Prime Minister has gone further to formalise that relationship with those mayors across the country by setting up the Council of Regions and Nations, where we'll have that formal seat at the top table to be able to feed in the concerns that we have from our local areas. So I think it was a really positive start. I think it's fair to say that the Prime Minister and this government recognise that mayors across the country are absolutely essential if he wants to achieve his growth goals that he has set very clearly in the manifesto and as part of his government. He doesn't want to borrow more, he doesn't want to cut services, he doesn't want to increase taxes other than where he set them out in the manifesto. He needs to unleash growth, and he was very clear in saying the only way that the government can succeed is if he allows mayors to succeed. So it was a really positive start generally. But also, from my point of view, as the only Tory mayor left at the moment, it was nice to see the Prime Minister inviting me before that meeting to have a one-on-one meeting with him. I'd never known Keir Starmer before, we'd never met before, and it was nice for him to hold out that olive branch and say that he wanted to work with me. And I was very clear with him. He's the Prime Minister of this country, and if he succeeds, then the country succeeds, and I'll work with anybody to help my area succeed as well. So I think it's a good start, both on a personal level, to work with this Labour government to try and get things done, and secondly, I think it's a really positive thing that they're doubling down on devolution.
What did you learn about him in that private meeting that you didn't know before?
Well, I learned what was really interesting. There was detail we got into about certain projects that we wanted support from the government on, and there was a very clear concern that not because of change of policy, but a transition from one government to another could see certain things fall through the cracks. So there was some detail in there, which I'm happy to go into. But the more interesting thing was the context of that. And one of the things that I took away from meeting the Prime Minister is that he is very much he's very much got the bit between his teeth. You can see, I think, over that weekend following the election victory that he had, he realised the size of the majority that he's got. Again, just listening to the programme there about some of the challenges that he's got, I think he sees that he's got such a large mandate, he's got such a big majority, that I don't think he's going to be frightened, certainly in the early days, of taking on some of the factions and some of the people within his own party to be able to deliver on the promises he made during the election. And that was really telling. That's something that came across really clearly. Oh, well,
let's talk about that. One thing that might get in the way of what is clearly a burgeoning bromance is the tension, which I think has already arisen between the government desire to devolve, on the one hand, and on the other hand, to absolutely ensure growth through busting through the planning system. And you've already had a bit of an experience of this. You want to regenerate a big area on Teesside and the Tees Works project. The Chancellor has said that she's going to refer it, she wants it referred to the National Audit Office, which will obviously hold it up. In the end, who's going to be in charge? Is it going to be Whitehall or is it going to be you?
Well, we'll have to wait and see how the government react. Like I say, the meeting I had with them, both collectively with the mayors and one-on-one with the Prime Minister, I've not met the Chancellor yet, was a positive one. We both clearly wanted to work together to get things done. You know, I can only take the Prime Minister at face value. As with anybody, I try and take them at face value. Ultimately, actions speak louder than words, and we're in very early days of, I think, a very positive and constructive relationship. But time will tell, and we'll have to wait and see how that plans out. Now, I would say to the Prime Minister, and I did say to the Prime Minister, that Teesside is the centre of the decarbonisation agenda. We've got billions of pounds worth of private investment, both landed and coming. And if he wants to achieve his growth goals, then he needs to support the plans that we have in Teesside.
OK, well, we'll talk again when the decision is made and see if things are quite as sunny. Let's talk about the Conservative Party. In 2019, Boris Johnson said that the people of the North East had lent the Tories their votes, and he was humbled by it. People want change, we must not let them down, and so on. Is the reason that so many took back their votes on July the 4th and handed them to Reform, that the Conservatives let those people down?
Well, I think it's fair to say that the result a couple of weeks ago now should send a very, very, very clear signal to the Conservative Party that we did let a lot of people down. I think one of the things that did frustrate me about the election campaign is we allowed this message to get caught up in the whole election, which was there was 14 years of Tory chaos and 14 years of Conservative failure. That's just demonstrably not true, right? The frustrating thing is we won in 2010, we won in 2015, 2017, 2019. So by and large, people were pretty happy with 10 years of a Conservative government. So what happened post-2019?
Well, I think that's a bit of a stretch, isn't it? The fact that you won the election doesn't necessarily mean people were thrilled, but carry on.
Well, no, I don't think so. I think people say that there's, they were trying to kind of create this smear and slur that there was 14 years of something that people didn't want. Well, people are happy with 10 years of Conservative government because, like I say, we got an 80-seat majority in 2019. So what happened after that? Well, we know what happened after that. One, you've got the macro issues around coronavirus, we've got wars in Ukraine, etc., which we can go into or not. But actually, within the Conservative Party, what we had were numerous different prime ministers, infighting, U-turns, and a party that lost its sense of duty and direction as a government that's supposed to serve this country. And that's what I've been talking about since the election, that the Conservative Party needs to be very, very clear, and I think they need to focus on the message, which is we lost the trust of the British people. People didn't see us as competent anymore, and in hindsight, and I didn't necessarily say this during the campaign because I didn't necessarily see it, but certainly in hindsight, it didn't matter, I think, what manifesto we put together, and it didn't matter how well Rishi Sunak performed on the campaign trail. We could have had the best manifesto and the best campaign. I just think people wanted to vote against a Conservative government. I think the data showed that. We didn't see a big increase in the Labour vote share. What we saw was people going out to vote to actively vote against a Conservative government. They felt that we'd failed them, we felt that we weren't competent anymore, we'd lost their trust, and they wanted that change. And that's something we need to focus on to be able to regain that trust.
They didn't vote for you, and as you say, the Labour vote didn't go up particularly. Where they went was Reform. Now, you've got a challenge here. What does the Conservative Party do next, and who would embody the right sort of change? James Cleverly, we read this morning telling friends that he's up for it. Ditto Tom Tugendhat. Who do you want as the next leader of your party?
I mean, I don't know at the moment. I've been asked that question numerous times, and I genuinely don't have an answer to it. It's too early. I think the thing about the leadership contest that's really interesting is we, by and large, know roughly who's going to stand. There might be a couple of wild cards that come out that people aren't necessarily expecting, and certainly probably aren't household names to people out there in the general public. But I think we, by and large, know who's going to stand. A lot of them haven't announced yet, but we kind of know. So we roughly know where they stand in the Conservative Party. The clear thing for this leadership contest is what are they going to do to rebuild that trust and confidence and rebuild that competence of the Conservative Party that we've always been well known for, so that we can fight the next election to hopefully regain power, to form the government. That's the bit we don't know, and that's the bit why I can't say who I would support yet, because nobody set that vision out.
That's fair enough. The Democratic Party can't decide on its own candidate, so I don't expect to get you to decide on your candidate instantly. But perhaps you could tell us, what's a sort of person? I mean, what's their profile? Should we be looking at the sort of person that a party that Suella Braverman's talking about, the sort of party that people like Tugendhat or Damien Green are talking about? What do you think is the future for the Conservative Party if it's going to come back from this?
Well, the future of the Conservative Party is a tried and tested one, and we lost our way over the last few years, and we lost what has always made us a very successful party, actually the most successful party in the Western world when it comes to democracy. And what we lost is that general competence. What we need is a leader who can go back to basics, understand that we are there to serve the British people, understand that we have to have a sensible hold on economics, understand that people want, by and large, relatively low taxes, they want good services, and they also want somebody that they can trust, and they also want a party that isn't going to fight like cats in a sack. And that's ultimately what drove the election result. People just didn't trust us anymore, and they thought ultimately that we cared more about the Conservative Party and infighting and positioning within the Conservative Party and the Conservative government than we did about serving our country. And what we want is somebody who cares about public service and actually can rebuild what will be potentially be a long road back into power. We want somebody who can be fresh, who can be new, and who can set out some clear ideas. And I don't think it's sorry to keep going, but I don't think it's necessarily about a lurch to the left or the right. It's about that point of competence. It's not about the spectrum of the Conservative Party, because we've always been a broad church.
Can I just ask you quickly about the manner in which the contest is conducted? I read this morning that one of the possible contenders, Suella Braverman, has been sharing her opinions, and she says that some of the party are, I'm quoting here, smug and self-righteous centrist cranks. Are you amongst the smug and self-righteous centrist cranks that she has in mind?
I hope I'm not, but I don't know what Suella defines as one of those people. I'll have to ask her whether she includes me in that group of people. But I did set out, actually, just last week, a letter that
perhaps we might need to hear a bit less from her. Would that be good for the party?
Sorry, I missed that. Apologies.
I was just asking, from what you were saying, you won't say it directly, but I'm taking that you think that we might hear... The Conservative Party might benefit from hearing a little less from Suella Braverman and that kind of language.
I think what and again, I was just about to say, I set out last week very clearly to all leadership candidates. Actually, I issued an open letter to anybody that wants to stand in the leadership contest. 3 things that I think this contest should be conducted in. 1, it shouldn't be about the past. It should be about what is the offering for this country in the future. 2, I think any leadership contender needs to rule out a partnership or a coalition or whatever relationship with Reform. They are a symptom of the problem. They are not the cause of the problem for the Conservative Party, and I think that way madness lies. And I think the third point, which is the point that you're putting to me right now, is that there shouldn't be any blue-on-blue attacks. If we want to spend the next 2, 3, 4, 5 months fighting with each other, that goes to the cause of the election defeat just 2 weeks ago. And I would implore Suella, as well as every other leadership contender, to conduct this leadership contest with civility. Let's come together and let's offer a positive option to the country.
Ben Houchen, thank you so much for your time this morning.
Pleasure. Thank you.
OK, let's go back to our panel of Greg Dyke, Anne McElvoy and Iain Dale. Iain, you dodged the bullet by not getting a seat, I suppose, but...
Well, given that seat went to the Liberal Democrats with an 8,500 majority, you have a point.
What do you make of what Ben Houchen's saying about the future of your party?
Well, by the end of that interview, I was thinking what a shame it is that he isn't in the House of Commons, because I think he would have stood a really good chance of winning had he been an MP. Well, let's start with Suella Braverman, shall we? My favourite subject. I mean, I wonder whether she was, when she mentioned the word cranks, whether she was actually looking in the mirror at the time. Ooh. Because, I mean, if she... I don't think she'll even stand, because she's blown up her campaign before it's even started. That article that she wrote in The Telegraph 2 days before the election, not 2 days after, that went down like a cup of cold sick with Conservative Party members. I mean, it's just the sort of thing you do not do. And her ridiculous comments in that speech in America that she made. I mean, I don't know what she's playing at if she actually does want to stand. So,
well, would you rather see back? Or let me put it this way. I mean, I'm not a betting person, and I know betting's got a bad name, but what odd would you place on her being in Reform by Christmas?
Evens. I mean, that seems to be the direction of travel. It is a shame because I don't know what political journey she's on, but it's clearly not one that is in tune, I think, with the rest of the Conservative Party. I think the main thing that any contenders for the leadership need to think about is, can I win? And if the answer to that question is no, don't bother standing. This contest needs to be between serious people. And there are one or two names that are being mentioned who all may have great advantages to them in many ways, but they are not leaders, and therefore they shouldn't stand.
And what do you think the Conservative Party... First of all, do you think, as some people suggested, that this was an extinction-level event for the Conservative Party, or do you think that eventually they'll come back?
No, I think they dodged that, actually. I mean, it was a lamentable result. This is not in any way to sort of give them any pass, and I think Ben Houchen's points were absolutely on point as to fundamentally why they lost. But there's something else I think he was kind of struggling to articulate a bit, which is, well, what would this Conservative Party look like? They could come back. When he said, well, lower taxes, better quality public services, well, that's what Labour seems to be. That's a hard enough one to pull off. You know, that's asking to have it both ways. But you can sometimes do it, but that is kind of where Labour is now. It's not that you've got a party in Labour that's very easy to attack as extreme. Then he said he wanted to stop fighting. Well, you only stop fighting when the conflict is over, and Iain has got a strong position there on Suella Braverman. I completely understand why he holds it, but the fact is there is an argument to be had in the Conservative Party about whether it does stay, not with the old One Nations. I think they're gone. There's a new form of centre-right that's robust, is probably a bit tougher and even more, kind of doesn't need to be shrill, but it needs to cut through. And that's why I wasn't quite sure Ben Houchen was saying, well, we should just go back to being competent. You need more than that. You need to be an attack on Labour with a huge majority. And some people, like Suella Braverman, effectively, whether they join Reform or proto-Reform, they and their media supporters want the kind of policies that Reform stands for. So where does that leave the Conservative Party now?
Is there a problem, Greg? I mean, actually, one of the criticisms you hear of both big parties, whose combined vote in this election was the lowest it's been for more than a century, is that this is managerialism, not really leadership going on.
Well, it's not. They've got a massive majority. Labour's got a massive majority, but it's not an overwhelming victory for the Labour Party. They won because of the electoral system we have by that number. This is not 1997 all over again, you know, when their share of the vote was much higher, which means that it could be difficult for them next time around.
Yeah, we've got an interesting graph here about why people think that the Conservatives lost. And most of it is policy, but, you know, the failure of managing various things. But I'm wondering whether, you know, we'll come back and talk about America in a moment, but we've seen right across, as you were saying, and we've seen right across Europe, the advance of a different kind of conservatism. Are they going to have to somehow reach an accommodation with that reform?
Didn't they lost because they were seen as incompetent?
Exactly. I mean, that's the word that isn't there. If you'd had incompetence up there, that would be at the top.
Yeah.
OK. So it's incompetence rather than being, for want of a better term, right-wing enough.
Well, you've got immigration failures there at 47%, quite high up there. I mean, lockdown parties, all right, that's not coming round again, we all hope. The NHS is a huge issue, and it's underfunded and it's mismanaged in many parts. But if you look at immigration as the next big thing, that would appear to be one of the guiding things that you look at across Germany, across France, across Italy. It does appear that you have to answer that question more convincingly. And you've got one answer, which is really hard line coming from Nigel Farage, which is, you know, don't let anybody in really as much as you can help it.
Net zero immigration.
And net zero immigration, which I think would be very damaging, by the way, for the country. But you do need a greater sense of control. So, yeah, to that extent, yes, it's moving rightwards. OK, up next, the future of Joe Biden as yet more Democrats tell him not to compete in the next election. I'll get a view from the party with Chair of Democrats Abroad, Kristin Kaplan Wolfe.
I was diagnosed with metastatic melanoma 4.5 years ago. which is regarded as life-limiting and incurable. And I felt incredibly isolated. I didn't know anyone else with melanoma or anybody with stage 4 cancer. And during lockdown, when I had my treatment, I found some online groups, and I found the power of sharing stories and hearing other people's stories gave me hope. So I decided to try and collate some other stories of cancer and hope to help people not feel alone. We have a number of stories covering a range of different cancers. There's about 13 different cancers. My story is in there. But we have stories of people who have set up charities. As a very good friend of ours, Kate Rackham, helped set up a breast cancer awareness charity. Nicola Nuttall has shared her story of her daughter Laura, who unfortunately was diagnosed with glioblastoma. And we have a number of stories from people that I knew and then people I got to know through social media and introductions. Chris Bryant features in the book, and he name-checks you as well in his story when he first talked about his melanoma when he was diagnosed a few years ago. And each story has the theme of hope at the centre. Within the book, I talk about people being affected by cancer, whether that's directly, I have cancer, but my wife, my friends, my family, they're all affected by cancer. And yes, you're right, unfortunately, some people are given terminal diagnosis, but there's always hope. If we look at Laura Nuttall and what she achieved in the 4.5 to 5 years after she was diagnosed, she has given so many other people hope. And when I was creating the book, it was important to include stories where not everyone lived happily ever after, because that is the unfortunate reality of cancer.
To the United States now, there's been a fairly relentless flow of senior figures in the Democratic Party, either in private or public, calling on Joe Biden to step aside and let someone else fight the election against Donald Trump. That's because of growing concern about his age and health. But the president is adamant he will do no such thing, even though increasingly dire polling shows that he's likely to lose. So, is something going to give? I can speak now to Democrats Abroad UK Chair Kristin Wolfe. Good morning, Ms. Wolfe.
Good morning, Trevor. Thank you for having me.
Pleasure. On a scale of 0 to 100, what are the chances that Joe Biden will be the Democratic Party's candidate on November the 4th?
Well, right now, I would say it's 100 because Joe Biden has said that he is going to be the candidate and he's in it to win it. So I take Joe Biden at his word that he is going to see this through to the end.
Really? I mean, from what we can see, it really looks like the party is, whether publicly or privately, coming round to the point of view that A, Mr. Biden will lose, and B, if he loses, he will take down many what you call down the ticket races for the House of Representatives. And the Democratic Party can't afford that because that would potentially give Congress to Mr. Trump as well. Are you sure he's not going to come round at some point?
Look, Joe Biden will talk to his advisors. He will talk to donors. He will talk and has been talking to all of these people. And, you know, at the end of the day, we have to remember a couple things, that there was a presidential primary held just 4 months ago, and 14 million Democrats turned out and voted for him. So for Joe Biden, he clearly has a mandate from the grassroots parts of the party. Now, I'm not saying that there isn't dialogue and discourse happening right now. There most certainly is. But this party, if Joe Biden decides to stay in the race, Joe Biden will lead us to victory in November. We are confident in that, and I'll tell you why. Because although there's a lot of people saying that our party is in disarray, I heard it in your intro earlier, our party has a track record of rallying around our candidates. And not only do we have Democrats that will rally, we know that there are also independents and Republicans who can no longer identify with the Republican Party that have come out and said that they will not vote for Donald Trump. The Republican Party, despite having a very unified MAGA base, is in disarray itself. And a lot of people, prominent people, have come out and said they won't vote for Donald Trump.
I think your confidence, I must say, is impressive. But we're keeping score, as people tend to do. And there are now 36 elected representatives in the House or Senate who have questioned Mr. Biden's fitness, and many more who won't speak out publicly. And I want to bring up particularly, if I may say so, Mr. Obama, his former boss and colleague, has clearly allowed it to be known that he has doubts, because for days there have been stories saying Obama has doubts about Biden, but he has not come out publicly and denied that. Are you disappointed by that?
I don't know what President Obama has said to President Biden. I don't know what those conversations are. And in fact, no one knows what those conversations are. It's all speculation. And I think that that is actually part of the challenge here. You know, people are privately having conversations about many things, I'm sure, and including, you know, should Joe Biden, is this the time for him to step down? But Joe Biden has come out himself and said with a lot of resolve that he believes that he still can and will win. And at this point in time, that is where our party is at, is he is our candidate on the ballot. And when it comes to November, voters will have two choices on the ballot. They will have the Democratic ticket and they will have the MAGA Republican ticket. That's their choice. And at this point, you know, there is a very stark difference between these two parties that we need to start bringing out in the conversation. And we need to move off these other conversations about, you know, his age and other things. That isn't going to change. Joe Biden's old and he's going to continue to be.
You yourself come from, I think, one of the crucial swing states, I think Wisconsin. And even there, which has always been pretty close, the polls have tipped pretty decisively against Biden. OK, can I ask you, what do you think he needs to do? Let's say he sticks with it, comes out of COVID isolation. What does he need to do? What does he need to show the American people that could change that again?
So what Joe Biden needs to do, and it's what Joe Biden has said he's going to do, is he's going to get, first off, back out on the campaign trail, because that's obviously really important. And, you know, I think that that is one thing that has not come out in a lot of the conversations around President Biden following the debate, is that he's not only been running the country, he's been doing a lot of campaigning around the country. He had a fantastic rally in Michigan. He had a fantastic rally in North Carolina. He needs to keep up the energy, and he needs to keep going. So he needs to go on the attack. He needs to go after Donald Trump on the policies.
Okay. Look, lastly, if you wouldn't mind indulging my scepticism for a moment, let's suppose he decides to stand aside. Who's the candidate? Does it have to be Kamala Harris?
Well, we don't have a process right now. If he decides to stand aside, that will have to be determined. But what I can say is that Kamala Harris is going to be a phenomenal president. She has been groomed for that role. That's what vice presidents' roles are, is to step into the shoes of the presidency. She has a very distinguished professional record as a district attorney, as an attorney general, as, you know, a vice president. And so she's done really well, in contrast to what the Republican Party has, which frankly is going to be a continuation of the MAGA agenda. And that, I think, is really going to, I think, seal the fate for that party.
Kristin, Wolfe, thank you very much for your time this morning.
Thank you.
Coming up, is the era of the culture wars really over? I'll speak to Equality and Human Rights Commission Chair Baroness Falkner. The new Culture Secretary says the culture wars are over under this new Labour government. It may not be that easy, as there seem plenty of opportunities for hostilities to continue, whether over trans people and women's rights or religious tensions in an increasingly divided electorate. And there's to be a new Race Equality Act. So let's talk to the Equality and Human Rights Commission Chair, Baroness Falkner. Kishwer, this is rather weird, having... Once upon a time, I sat in that chair. But anyway, let's do the best we can. Look, Lisa Nandy, the Culture Secretary, says in her first remarks after being appointed that culture wars are over. What do you think she meant by that?
Well, it's quite enigmatic, isn't it, Trevor? Because it's a question of whether you believe that legitimate concerns, legitimate discussion about perhaps what your children are taught at school, or whether your mother has her privacy respected in a hospital ward, or whether an employee feels safe going to the loo in the workplace, whether those things are legitimate areas for public debate or not. I mean, after all, we live in a free society and we should be free to discuss what we want to discuss. But there is an important thing, I think, which is perhaps what she was hinting at, and that is that sometimes the application of the law or the interpretation of the law by tribunals does result in a weaponization of what the law is. And that creates anxiety and fear among minorities particularly.
For example?
Sorry?
For example?
Well, for example, whether religion and belief incorporates gender-critical beliefs, or whether racism tribunals are too generous to award discrimination payments. When you pick up a newspaper, you sometimes do get the impression that there is a little bit more than the headline suggests to the story. And there is a tendency to run with the headline rather than run with the substance. And I suspect in good faith that that's what she meant.
Before we get into some of the issues, I just want to touch on the recent election campaign, which always comes into the Commission's remit in a way. During the last month, identity politics issues, gender and race and religion, touched off a lot of controversy. And in particular, women candidates said that they felt unsafe. Are you at all concerned about the tone of politics?
I think we're concerned about whether the Democratic Compact, which is that you may not agree with the party's policies, and you express that disagreement in the secrecy of the ballot box, whether that has broken down and we now get people who harass and intimidate candidates in the public square. And we're talking about quite serious harassment and intimidation. I understand the police are looking at several cases. So we are concerned about that, and we have a duty to foster good relations between different groups of people. We wrote to political parties in advance of the election to give them guidance on how they should be moderate and in their campaigning literature and rhetoric. Of course, we had no basis of writing to the whole public, but there are sections of the public that simply seem to think that they need to play the person rather than the ball.
Do you feel that people were actually respecting that this time? It's always been an issue. When I was there, it came up in 2 or 3 elections. Do you think people are really paying attention? We've done this before.
Well, the level of intimidation is higher than I've ever noticed in any election to date. And I think that's why I go back to that social compact. Somehow, we need to make the public understand that it is public service, that candidates are standing up to serve the public, to serve them. And they have got to be given the space to express what they want to do, to express their ambitions, or to criticise each other, which is, all of these things are protected. Free expression is protected under human rights law.
One of the hottest issues, of course, is gender and sex. And this week you published new guidance, which asserted, that I read it, that where there is a genuine occupational requirement based on sex, for example, to be a worker in a women's refuge, sex means biological sex. Now, some Labour ministers have said, and still I think say, trans women are women. How's that guidance gone down there?
Well, I don't know because I haven't heard from government ministers as to what they think of it. Trevor, we are the experts. We are the Equality and Human Rights Commission. We are there to interpret the Equality Act. And we are entirely confident that the guidance that we issue is correct. We've gone through years of activist groups and sometimes even politicians saying that they think we've got it wrong. We have never been challenged in court. So we're confident that we've got it right. And the reason we've issued the guidance is because employers don't seem to understand what the Act says. And you're absolutely right in your interpretation that that in that case you gave about employing perhaps a woman to serve in a rape crisis counselling centre or an organisation like that, employers are perfectly entitled to say, we want a woman, a female, who has a birth certificate to say she's female. They can even go so far as to exclude a trans woman with a GRC. But a
gender recognition certificate.
That's right, with a gender recognition. But as long as they can objectively justify it.
One of the things that you wanted to do prior to the election to help clear this up was to introduce a small change to the Equality Act, defining sex in the Act as biological sex. Are you still going to be pressing the new government to do that?
Well, it isn't the only route. We examined it over 2 years. We examined the issue over 2 years, saw the extent of litigation that there was around it. You may know that there's a case coming up to the Supreme Court, the highest court in the land, asking them to clarify what the meaning of a woman is. So it continues to be a very active debate.
But you have no doubts in your mind about this?
Well, we asked, it is really for government to put forward legislation, but we have a duty to advise government. And in our mind, on balance, it would provide greater clarity than not. At the moment, it is a highly contested, misunderstood area of the law, and it's our job to tell government when they can clarify it. But it isn't the only route. Our route is not the only route. There are other routes, such as changing the Gender Recognition Act. They could do that too. One
of the things that we know that the government plans to do is to introduce what it calls a draft Race Equality Act. What do you think the point of that is? And will it help us? Will it confuse things? What's the plan here?
Well, we know there have been 5 or 6 race discrimination and race equality acts since 1965, when the first one came into law. So to have yet another one, we think at the Equality and Human Rights Commission that there are areas where discrimination still continues to happen. But we wonder whether a new act is the way, and we'll await with keen anticipation what the Act will say. I think it will also have disability in it, where we're also finding some extent of discrimination there. So we will make up our mind once we've seen it. But it's going to be an interesting development.
OK, let me ask you lastly something which I suppose I'm cheating here a little bit, which perhaps only 2 people who've occupied this position could discuss. I think there are 4 of us who've been in that chair. Your term of office comes to an end and you're, I think, up for reappointment. One of the key provisions we put in place when we invented the Equality and Human Rights Commission was political independence. There is talk of a Labour peer being succeeding you. That slightly surprised me. Can you see somebody who takes the Labour whip being able to do, or any political whip, being able to do this job?
Look, Trevor, I don't want to get into personalities, but I
haven't mentioned any names.
But I think it's fair to say that one of the oversight committees that we have to report to, the Joint Committee on Human Rights, published a report as long ago as 2010, where they said that the composition of the commission did not appear to be independent in the sense that there were 8 Labour-affiliated people on the board at that time, 1 Lib Dem, which was 3/4 of the board. So I think it's fair to say that I'd like to tell you what my current situation is. I don't have a single member of my board with a political affiliation. We don't have very many people in our staff. Less than 5% of our staff are affiliated to political parties. By the way, they're entirely entitled to be affiliated. But I've worked phenomenally hard in the last 4 years to bring in impartiality into our decision-making and to preserve our independence. It's been challenged at the UN again and again, and we have not been found wanting.
Okay,
and that's what I'd like to see continue.
Thank you. Well, harking back to 2010, I wonder who the idiot who was in charge then was. Thank you very much, Kishwer Falkner. We'll be back with our panel in a moment.
They've pushed the protesters further back here. There's around 200 or 300 still remaining.
I'm Dan Whitehead and I'm Sky News' West of England correspondent. This van goes onto the streets of Plymouth 7 days a week, 365 days a year.
These facilities at the moment are a lifesaver. It's all we've got.
From fishing communities to bustling cities, we spend every day reporting from across the region, hearing from people who have real stories.
I'll have nowhere to live for about 3 or 4 months.
There are still people inside the properties here. They're coming from the epicentre of what is now a global health pandemic. We were seeing and speaking to young women who were selling themselves right on the high street. It was desperately sad, and the fact it was happening right in the heart of this community. Before Brexit, these oysters were being exported to the EU, but the trade stopped overnight.
What's your feeling about the future then?
Blake might all be finished, I don't know.
Back with our panel, Greg Dyke and McElvoy and Iain Dale. Anne, you have literally flown in. You got off a plane a couple of hours ago from Chicago, having been at the Republican National Convention. Did you have a religious experience?
Well, it was certainly, me personally, I had a very hard-working experience, but kind of handmaiden to the arts of political journalism. But yes, there was a messianic feel. And of course, Donald Trump coming there, still bandaged from that near miss in the terrible shooting. The last weekend, when we headed for the RNC, this was still hadn't happened. There he came back. There was that extraordinary moment when he got on the stage, then spoke for an hour and a half. Whatever you think about Donald Trump, and there was certainly, I think, one fact checker counted 22 untruths, some blatant ones, not the ones you could argue about. So that has not changed about Donald Trump, but the energy is there, the determination is there, and of course he's got that image, the fight, fight, fight image, which I think is going to become the big symbol of the campaign. So they leave Milwaukee, Trevor, thinking that they're in a great position, and then J.D. Vance is in there as the vice president. You know, let's face the music and Vance. So it's going to be a pretty impressive ticket if you're on the Republican side. The Democrats, I'm sure, we're going to come to.
Indeed, in fact, we talked about that iconic image last week. I agree with it. It has all of the echoes of raising the flag over Iwo Jima and all of that. But coming back to J.D. Vance, it's quite extraordinary. It's quite interesting, actually, that the president and the vice president both will be the authors. I mean, OK, did Trump write it? But anyway, they'll have had million-selling memoirs published under their names, so the American public actually knows quite a lot about them and their story. Do you agree with me that the appointment of Vance was really quite significant and unusual?
I think it's unusual in the sense, and I think you've referred to it, that you used to do a kind of balanced ticket. That's not where Donald Trump is going with his appointment. It's make MAGA, make America great again. He believes that he can expand that. He has this vast confidence, perhaps overconfidence, that he can expand that into parts of the voter base that he didn't reach before. Hence J.D. Vance, whether to use the unflattering term isolationism, to use the language they would use, get out of wars, look to Americans and their interests first of all. Don't worry about Ukraine and all that other stuff. So, yes, I think this is the way that they're heading. It's very unambiguous.
Greg, we've discussed the possibility of Trump before. I think your blood's running cold, isn't it?
Yes, I think the events of last weekend have made him much more likely to win. And I think that's a scary prospect for the rest of the world. But we will see.
Iain, what do you reckon? Let me introduce a note of dissent here. Are we all suffering from Trump derangement syndrome, and that actually he's never going to be the thing that many people say he's going to be? Or is he?
Well, a lot of people thought, and I was among them, that when he actually became president in 2017, that he would change, he would become presidential. And I was in Washington covering his inauguration and sitting there in a studio listening to his inauguration speech. And I remember saying to my producer, what on earth am I going to say at the end of this?
American carnage.
Because normally, as a broadcaster would repeat a few of the lines and try and explain what they meant and all the rest of it. And in the end, I found myself saying that, well, that was a speech that Benito Mussolini could have made. In the way that he was strutting around and sort of the tone of it, not necessarily the content. And he didn't really change from that in his 4 years. Now, will he be different this time? It might partly depend on the appointments that he makes to his cabinet, who's Secretary of State. But you think he did actually have some quite good people around him last time, and they all fell by the wayside. So I'm not sure there's a massive pool to choose from this time of what we would probably call sensible people. I don't think I suffer from Trump derangement syndrome. I've just sort of observed him and come to, I think, the right conclusion. However, watching that debate with Joe Biden, even I started to think, well, maybe it might be better to have Trump, who's actually sort of vaguely compos mentis, than Biden, who clearly is declining in that department.
It would be interesting to know whether do the Republicans want Biden to stay as the candidate, because after that debate, I think Biden, after the debate and the shooting, I think Biden is going to lose.
Well, I think it's been quite significant that in his speeches, Trump has said explicitly Kamala Harris will be a more difficult candidate, which to me means actually they want to keep Biden because the more you play up the Kamala Harris's difficulty for the Republicans, the more anyway. But just coming back to Trump's 2.0, there is a school of thought, Anne, that says actually Trump 2.0 will be pretty much the same as Trump number 1, part 1, but he'll be more competent because his team will understand how to govern. And for those who oppose him, he will be more dangerous.
He will move faster. And I think that's the key sometimes. You've only got 4 years. If you're Donald Trump, you can only serve 4 years. He has signalled very clearly, I mean, it's a massive laundry list of many retrograde policies that he wants from drill, baby, drill. I mean, you can forget green targets, you can forget all sorts of things that we've begun to take for granted as areas where the US and Europe and beyond are more aligned. He's said that he's going to move fast towards a deal, as he puts it, on Ukraine. But what kind of deal and whether that is at all to the way that the present government of Ukraine would like to see this concluded, it is very much, I think, up in the air. I was interviewing his former head of comms in the last communications in the last campaign, the one that didn't work. And I said, well, what's different then? And he said, the difference is he's no neophyte now. He's not new to the job. And although it was interesting, Iain saying, oh, yeah, he's not going to surround himself with people who are professionals, experts in the way that would appeal to the transatlantic relationship as we understand it, he does have a big bench of advisors who want to come in, particularly on foreign and security policy. OK,
each of you, 10 seconds. Trump 2.0, better or worse than Trump 1.0?
I'm always an optimist, Trevor.
OK.
I think he's more deranged now than he was last time.
Wow. Deranged in what sense?
Well, if you read what he says, what is all over the place, I think it's really scary this time.
OK.
I thought it was scary last time, mind.
All right. Well, that is it for this week's show. We will see during this week what comes back from Delaware. I'll tell you next Sunday whether we are in a two-horse or a new horse fight. Join us again, 08:30 next Sunday. And by the way, watch Ali and Sophie, 7 o'clock every night this week.